Morning folks, how you doing? I'm stitching together a wee video for you today. It seems that some of the gear chat videos have proved to be quite popular, and I've been asked a couple of times if I could put together a wee video on tents. So I'm going to try and stitch something together for you. It's going to be purely on my own tent collection. It's going to be fairly non-technical, but it will give you a glimpse or an insight into the range of tents that I own and how I use them. I'm going to start off by showing you a tent that I don't have any longer. I've owned 2 roof tents in the past, and I've also owned a trailer tent. So I don't have a roof tent anymore, and I don't have a trailer tent. The camper van, which is sitting outside on the driveway there, is taken over from these particular bits of kit, but I'll show you a couple of wee images of them, and then we'll get into the tents that I actually still own. Okay, so these are big hefty bits of kit that really require a vehicle for moving around, or certainly you need a method of getting them to the campsite. You're not going to strap these things onto your back. You're certainly not going to be carrying a roof tent around in your rucksack. The big teepee tent that you saw there, it's perfect for canoe camping, providing you're not covering huge distances that might involve portaging. But if you're simply paddling out to an island, as Mo and I often do, then putting the big teepee tent and the wood stove in the bottom of the canoe, it's an effective way of setting up a long-term base camp. However, if you're working in the hills, as I did for extended periods, then you do need to consider a base camp tent, something that is a little bit more comfortable, a bit more spacious, where you can lay out some of your gear, where you can rest and relax, and also where you can work. So the next wee clip, I'm going to show you my base camp tent. It's a Vango Force 10 Mark V, which is a big tent. In fact, my first ever proper tent was a Vango Force 10 Mark II, the one with a ridgepole and a sloping ridgepole, A-frame at the front and a single pole at the back. The one that I'm going to show you here is very similar, except it's a double A-frame with a ridge pole on it. That wee Vango Force 10 Mark II that I bought when I was about 17 years old. In fact, I lived in it for around 6 months. I went off on an extended trip, first down to Wales, climbing for about 3 or 4 weeks with a friend, and then when he was at work at that time, so he went back to work, and I tried my hand at the hitchhiking. I hitchhiked down to Dover, and then I got the ferry across to Calais, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but basically I travelled around parts of Europe, mostly France, Holland, Belgium, and into Germany. And eventually I met up with my brother, who was stationed over in Germany at that time, and he gave me a lift back. I can't remember, back to England. I can't remember where it was. I don't know, it might have been Felixstowe or something like that. And then he dropped me off, and he had to go off and do his own thing. I managed to hitchhike from there up to the Scottish borders, and then I just ran all out of luck. I couldn't get a lift, so I was travelling fairly light, and I'd been on the road for a long time, and I was young and adventurous and fit, so I thought I could just walk home. So I walked up through the hills and eventually got back home to Edinburgh, was where I was living at that particular time. So that wee Vango Force 10 Mark II was home for 6 months, for every night of that 6 months, and I really enjoyed that tent. Some very fond memories. So what I'm going to show you now is my Mark V, which is my big base camp tent that I've used in various locations around the world. Okay folks, so that's my base camp tent, my Vango Force 10 Mark V, which is a ridgepole tent if you like, or A-frame tent, a super strong tent. But what I want to do now is to move on to a different type of tent altogether. I want to look at tents that you can actually carry around in the mountains with you. I'm going to start off with a fairly heavy tent, but it's definitely my go-to tent if I'm going to be camping high in Scotland, where there's a danger of strong winds or extreme cold or a big accumulation of snow. It's also most certainly my go-to tent for camping in exposed locations in the Himalayas. It's a Terra Nova Quasar, it's a geodesic tent, it's a 4-pole tent, so super strong. So let me show you that. Well folks, that's my Terra Nova Quasar 4-pole geodesic tent that I use in extreme conditions, certainly when I'm going to be summit camping or when I'm out in the Himalaya camping in exposed conditions. When the weather is going to be particularly rough, I would consider doubling up the poles on that tent, so the pole sleeves are big enough to take a second set of poles. And also if I'm camping in snow, I would probably anchor the tent using snow anchors. You'll have to look back at one of my older videos to see what I'm talking about in terms of how to fashion some snow anchors and make sure that your tent is well cinched down when you're camping in deep snow. But what I want to do now is I want to move on a little bit. I want to continue, however, with geodesic tents, and I want to show a tent that has been with me for many years, featured in many of my videos, so it's going to be very familiar to the regular viewers. It's a Crux tent. I can't actually remember the model, I've had it for so long. And it is also a 4-pole tent, however it's super lightweight. It's a fraction of the weight of my Quasar. In fact, Terra Nova, I believe, also do a lightweight geodesic tent, which is called, oh, can I remember the name of it now? My brother has one, and I think it's called the Ultra, the Terra Nova Quasar Ultra. And when I first heard that, I thought, oh, it must be kind of ultra strong or ultra heavy or whatever, but in fact it's ultra light. So it's a very similar tent to the one that I'm just about to show you. But I'm a great fan of my Crux tent. I've used it in all sorts of conditions and all sorts of weather, and in fact if you look back at one of the older videos, you'll see that I used it in fairly extreme windy conditions when I was camping up by Loch Skeen in the Scottish borders not that long ago. So let me show you the Crux geodesic 4-pole tent. So folks, that's my Crux 4-pole geodesic tent. It's probably the tent that I use most for my travels around Scotland, especially when I'm going to be crossing high ground or camping in exposed locations. But I want to move away from 4-pole tents now. I want to show you a 3-pole tent that I have. It's a North Face tent called the Tadpole. It's probably 25, maybe even 30 years old. I've had it for a very long time. I bought it for a number of expeditions that I made to the Pacific Northwest, expeditions that were carried out in the autumn time, fairly benign weather where I didn't need the toughest of tents. It proved to be a very useful tent in that situation. I'm not sure how good it would be for Scottish conditions, although I have camped in it in Scotland on a number of occasions, but I tend to take a very close look at the weather forecast before I go out summit camping with this wee tent. So let me show you a wee glimpse at an older North Face tent called the Tadpole. I have no idea if they still make this tent or not, but let's have a wee look at it. Well folks, that was an example of a 3-pole tent, my North Face Tadpole. I do actually have another 3-pole tent in my gear room downstairs there, but in fact I want to move away from 3-pole tents and go straight into discussing 2-pole tents. The reason that I want to do that is because for my particular type of camping, I prefer to have a 4-pole geodesic tent when I'm in exposed situations or for winter camping in Scotland or indeed in the Himalayas. And then when I'm going lightweight, I tend to opt for a 2-pole tent. So the 3-pole tents are absolutely brilliant, they have their place, I do own a couple of them, but most of my camping is done in either a 4-pole tent or in a 2-pole tent. Now I want to discuss a particular type of 2-pole tent. I want to show you an example of a Gore-Tex tent. So 2-pole single skin. I can hear many people groaning already, and I can understand that because although there is a place for them, I'm not sure that Scotland is the best place for them. So I used single skin Gore-Tex tents when I was in the Himalaya, where we were subject to a continental climate. The conditions were more predictable. We had a lot of cold, dry weather, especially when we were at altitude, and at altitude every kilogram counted in your rucksack, especially because we were working and we were collecting, so our weight was actually getting heavier as the expedition went on because we were finding samples and we had to process these samples and carry them back to the base. So we had to keep our camping equipment as light as possible, and that's where the 2-pole single skin tent really came into its own in dry, thin air, where we really just needed some shelter, and we didn't need the addition of a fly sheet or the additional poles that come with 3 or 4 pole tents. So let me stop blethering and show you an example of a single skin tent. I've actually got 3 of these tents. I've got an ancient old one, I've got the one that I'm going to show you that I use in Scotland, which is actually not ideal for exposed camping because it sits very high, so it's a really comfortable tent to camp in as a solo space to occupy, because you can actually sit upright in it quite comfortably. The other two that I've got, one is a kind of worn out outdoor designs tent, and the other one is a RAB tent that lives out in the station in the Himalaya, and they're much lower to the ground, squat little tents, and they can actually be quite uncomfortable for any extended period of camping, but for the odd overnighting or for moving fast and light, they can be extremely useful. So I'm going to show you the taller version that I keep in Scotland and I use now and again when I'm out doing a bit of backpacking. So let me show you. Okay, so that was my 2-pole single skin Gore-Tex tent made by Outdoor Designs that I sometimes use in Scotland. And then at the end I showed 2 other Gore-Tex tents, a wee red one also made by Outdoor Designs. I think the photograph was taken in the Fisherfield Hills, and the final photograph in that clip was a RAB Gore-Tex tent which was photographed in a glacial valley in southwest China underneath a big mountain massif known in Chinese as the Yulong Shuishan or the Jade Dragon Snow Mountain. But what I want to do now is to show you another, I suppose, 2-pole tent. I say suppose because it has the cross piece, but the long piece has 2 Y-shaped or V-shaped pieces on the end of it, so it has more bracing. So although strictly speaking it is only 2 poles, it is a more robust 2-pole tent. It's a 4-season tent, a lightweight little single person tent, a solo tent, made by Terra Nova, one of my favourite companies, but I'm not sponsored by them, I hasten to add, it's just that I like their equipment. It's called the Terra Nova Southern Cross 1. They make a Southern Cross 2, which is a 2-person version, but let me show you that. I've got a couple of clips of that out and about. I think one is filmed in the Lost Valley in Glencoe. I'll try and see if I can find a wee clip of that for you. And then it's a tent, because it is so compact, I quite often use it when I'm kayak camping, so it fits in the front hatch of my kayak, my sit on top kayak, and it's just perfect for shelter when I'm camping and fishing along the west coast. So let me see if I can find a wee clip of that for you as well. So that's my Terra Nova Southern Cross 1, folks. I said that I was going to show you a little bit of footage of that in the Lost Valley, and then perhaps again on the western seaboard someplace during a kayak camp, but while I was searching for that I found another bit of footage that I captured in the southern Cairngorms above the Linnacoik, so I put that in as well. I hope that didn't confuse you. What I want to do now is turn my attention to a tent, if I can call it that. It's really just a bug screen, a two-pole shelter that I used when I was working in some subtropical or tropical areas. I've never actually mentioned that on the channel before, but in the past I did do a little bit of work in equatorial regions. I was based just north of the equator on the north shore of Lake Victoria for a wee while, doing some work there, and I've also worked in subtropical climes in the southern part of China, and there the main problem really is in the evening finding a space that is bug free where you can sit and relax or sleep unmolested by the insects. So I've got a wee structure here to show you that I used when I was in, as I say, tropical or subtropical climes. Let me show you it. Just a bug shelter, folks. Well folks, that was a wee glimpse of part of my tent collection. I hope you found this video entertaining, perhaps even informative, especially if you're in the market for a tent. But what I would like to do now in closing this video is to move away from tents altogether and talk for a couple of minutes about bivouac shelters, bivy bags some people call them. Over the years I've gathered a number of pieces of equipment that can be used as shelter when moving through mountain country. And certainly when I was doing my fieldwork in the Himalaya, it was my preference, if at all possible, to carry a bivouac shelter in my rucksack rather than a tent, simply because I wanted to keep the weight down. So I'll put together a few images and show you one or two pieces of equipment that I've used over the years. My go-to piece of bivouac equipment is not as you might expect. I think people would maybe expect that I would carry a tarp, and although I've done a bit of tarp camping, I prefer the bivouac bag, if I'm being absolutely honest, and the one that I give the thumbs up to is my hooped bivvy. In some ways it's like a tiny mini tent. It's ideal for sleeping in, but obviously no use for cooking in. So really what you have to do if you're going out on extended trips with just a bivouac is be able to work with nature. Try and read the lie of the land a little bit so that you can find some shelter, or be prepared to rearrange nature. So when I was camping in the boulder fields, I became quite adept at building wee dry stone dikes so that I could tuck in behind them and get a little bit of respite from the weather, a little bit of shelter. Or if I was in the forest, I would gather up wind blow or brash and make a kind of natural shelter, which would supplement my sleeping arrangement in my bivvy bag. So I don't have any images of that to show you. They're all old 35mm images that are not digitized yet. But at one stage, at one point, I may knuckle down and change the format of these images so that I could put them into a video. But for the time being, you'll just have to have a wee look at the equipment. I filmed all of this yesterday, all of the tents in the garden yesterday, because it was a fine day, and I thought, well, what's the chances of rain coming in to get all that equipment wet? I thought very, very slim. I checked the weather forecast very carefully, and no chance of rain, or impossible that we could get a snowstorm at this time of the year. So wait till the end of the video, folks. So I'm going to wind the video up here. I'll thank you for your views, and please do feel free to comment if you would like to, and hopefully I'll get back to you soon on the next one. and I'm not sitting in my office here, but we're out and about. So thanks again folks, stay safe, stay tuned, bye for now.